looking up at our friend here, the Duke of Wellington, or Arthur Wellesley. You can see he's atop his horse, named after the city I'm originally from, Copenhagen. If that's not an innuendo, I don't know what is. But he's sitting there, he's looking at Apsley House, which is behind us at the moment, which was his London home after he won his most significant battle, for which he is most famous, the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where he defeated Napoleon, well, you could almost say a second time, at the final decisive battle. He's flanked by 4 soldiers here that represent the Royal Guards today, if you will, or at least they are part of the old regiments of the Royal Guards. The foot soldiers, for which he was famous, of forming into a disciplined and formidable force. Because by the time that Arthur Wellesley got in command of much of the English army, it was in complete disarray. Most of the grunts or foot soldiers, if you will, they were composed of crooks and the dregs of society, desperate people who were happy to take a job where they could get a clean set of clothes, whereas the officers mostly came from spare sons of the nobility that just bought their way into their positions, so that was not necessarily much better. So it was this state of the British Army that he got famous for reshaping into a force that would eventually come to dominate the world. You can even see when he's born, almost by fate, he was born in the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte in 1769. Now, other features of the statue, well, you can see he's got his telescope and he's looking at Apsley House, and I mentioned he was sitting on Copenhagen. Certainly, this was a very beloved horse. Now, he's quoted as having said, it's not the fastest horse, it's not the prettiest horse, but he has got endurance. And that is what he remembered it for in particular. It carried him through the Battle of Waterloo for about 17 hours straight. So this horse could certainly take a bunch. And even when he lived here in London, in his civil life, he used the horse as his main means of transportation, riding around here and going down occasionally to his favorite club, his gentleman's club, which we'll visit later. This is, of course, one of the places he would have gone to, Apsley House. This was his London home that he bought in 1817, so just 2 years after the Battle of Waterloo, he moved in here. Now, he bought the house from his older brother, Richard, who was in dire financial straits, but because good old Duke of Wellington here, or good old Arthur Wellesley, was a war hero, he could afford buying the home and acquit his brother of his debts, and then move in himself with his wife Kitty. Interestingly enough, this is where he got the nickname the Iron Duke. And the Londoners started calling him that because if you look at the ground floor windows here, those windows would quite often be smashed by bricks thrown in through them. You would have unruly mobs and crowds coming here, demonstrating, protesting outside his house. You might wonder, why would that be? Well, there were a few different occasions for this. First of all, he was not nearly as popular as a prime minister as he was as a general. He was very elitist, extremely conservative, and he opposed things like the Great Reform Bill, which would allow more people to vote. He thought that was a really bad idea. So in 1832, that's where he faced severe protest from that. There was also in this time that many people from the countryside were starting to lose their jobs because of the Industrial Revolution, and they took out their anger here on the home of the Prime Minister at the time, right? So he had iron bars installed in front of his ground floor windows there, and that prompted the Londoners to call him the Iron Duke, because that was the only way he could protect his precious windows. He's also known as the Beef. Now that, I'm yet to discover exactly why he's called the Beef, but I know there is a dish named after him, the Beef Wellington. Okay, so now we're back out here at Hyde Park Corner. Here we've got the Wellington Arch. It wasn't its initial name though, but it got renamed to the Wellington Arch when they wanted this archway to commemorate the Duke of Wellington, since he was living right nearby. And it didn't used to be here actually, it used to be over there, right next to Apsley House, working as an entrance to Hyde Park. And back then when it was over there was another huge equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington on top of this archway here, which was widely ridiculed because it looked completely out of proportion with the rest of the archway. It was a massive statue that almost looked bigger than the archway itself, weighing up to 40 tons, made of solid bronze. So yeah, it faced quite a bit of ridicule in newspapers, but people thought they couldn't move the archway, they couldn't remove the statue when he was still alive. It would be a slight on his honor if they did. So it was only after his death in 1852 that they started working on rearranging the Wellington Arch and eventually replacing the equestrian statue with the quadriga, which you see here, which actually counts as the largest bronze sculpture in all of Europe, if you still count this country as being part of Europe, of course. And yeah, there's a museum inside. There's actually several museums inside this day and age, like 4 different floors, some of them dedicated to Wellington, some of them dedicated to modern art, interestingly enough. But it used to be one of the smaller police stations here in London. It used to be actually one of the smallest ones. There used to be a little police station in there where the police could keep an eye on affairs around here and then salute when the royal family came driving out of the gates right over there. So it's pretty interesting, this area here. It's not only commemorating the Duke of Wellington here at Hyde Park Corner. You'll see there's lots of different war memorials, most of them dedicated to World War I, World War II, like the New Zealand Memorial and the Australian Memorial and the Memorial for the Royal Artillery. And interestingly enough, a little memorial over there of David, who was turned around 180 degrees because he was very distracting to the traffic around here. Yeah. So part of the reasoning, not only because the Duke of Wellington statue looked pretty ridiculous, but they also wanted to ease up on traffic here in Hyde Park Corner, which has been a problem since forever, since this area has been around, really. So they wanted to move the archway over here. So they demolished it and rebuilt it here to make sure that traffic could pass through more easily. Traffic is still a problem, but at least it's eased up on affairs a little bit here. Sure, these are officers that were served with the Duke of Wellington. Most likely. But it's a guess. Got the Duke's false teeth, made from real human teeth, widely available, especially since human teeth were pulled out from the mouths of dead soldiers. Look at that. We were just wondering about that massive Napoleon statue. Do you know why he decided to take it?
The British government bought it for him and gave, and presented it to him because Napoleon hated it.
Right,
even
perfect.
Napoleon worked out that it was a little bit OTT.
Right. So here's an interesting little detail about the Royal Guards that sort of connects with the Battle of Waterloo. The bearskin hats that they're wearing today is a symbolic trophy of winning the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, because Napoleon's elite guard, his elite foot soldiers, wore the customary bearskin hat. And after the British managed to win at the battle, they adopted that, or at least the Royal Guards adopted that as part of their public uniforms, their ceremonial uniforms, which they still have to this day. This is pretty close to the uniform they would have worn going into battle about 200 years ago, which would have been in the Duke of Wellington's time as well, where they were known as the Red Coats the world over. But the red of the uniforms actually comes from earlier than that. That was formed in the 1660s when they, oh sorry, even earlier than that, in the 1650s, right, with the Grenadiers and the Scots and the Coldstream Guard. And the reason why they got red uniforms, not as dramatic as you might think, is because it was the cheapest dye available on the market. Lucky for them, it didn't turn out to be beige or salmon, but a fairly fetching color of red, but that was a cheaper dye. We've also got Buckingham Palace right behind us here, which became the royal residence when Queen Victoria moved in 1837. And by that time, Arthur had stepped back from politics. He had served very briefly as Prime Minister one last time in 1834 for about 3 weeks. But at this point, when Queen Victoria came up and stepped up to the plate, he was more of an old veteran and an old war hero who could occasionally come with advice from the side, but he had more or less retired from politics. But he was a constant and prominent figure in English politics and English society, well up until his death in 1852. But he was stepping back coming around her reign. But yeah, he certainly would have, he did attend her coronation, so he did follow the coronation parade going here from Buckingham Palace all the way down to Westminster Abbey. A coronation which was famously disastrous, so he would probably have shared in a lot of the embarrassment there, particularly when Queen Victoria's finger was too large for the coronation ring and it was jammed on her little finger. There were lots of little problems throughout that happened, and I'm sure the Duke would have face-palmed a few times throughout. But fortunately, the Queen managed to escape from that with more or less all of her grace intact. It's mostly everybody else who got embarrassed. We'll be moving further up this way. We'll actually go back to his old stomping grounds, to his old gentleman's club. He might have ridden through here a couple of times on his horse Copenhagen. Also up on the Piccadilly, he would have ridden quite a few times. That was like his private car of the time. That was his horse, which he often took to the gentleman's club known as the Athenaeum. I think it's called the Athenaeum. I might double check the pronunciation on that. The Athenaeum? Athenaeum. Athenarum. Let's find out.
Athenaeum.
The Athenaeum.
Athenaeum.
You would have gone to the Athenaeum Club.
Athenaeum.
Athenaeum.
Athenaeum. Okay.
So we are right next here to Prince Frederick II, the Grand Old Duke of York, and one of the generals you could consider a predecessor to the Duke of Wellington, before Arthur Wellesley's time. Now this guy is a contested figure, because on one hand he is blamed for a lot of the military failures of the British Army at the time. At the same time, he also managed to put in lots of new reforms that were badly needed for the army, which made the military machine, or sort of paved the way for the British military machine that the Duke of Wellington could later utilize in the Peninsular Wars and Napoleonic Wars. So, a very ambivalent figure, already shown just in the column that's raising him way above there. That was put together from private donations from his own men, because they knew that if his statue would be down on the ground, that his creditors would come after him and probably melt his statue down for profit. Because good old Frederick here, he had a bit of a gambling problem, and he also usually put huge bets on the horse races. which did put him severely in debt at the time of his death. So he's one of the few statues around here which is secured by lots of elevation. Now, you might have heard the Grand Old Duke of York nursery rhyme. It's made fun of Grand Old Dukes of York for a very long time. And it goes, well, the beginning, of course, you've probably heard. Oh, the Grand Old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men, marched them up to the top of the hill and marched them down again. It's making fun of his indecisiveness on the battlefield and marching his soldiers up the hill before quickly marching them down again. And that was the reputation that this guy suffered under. But historians debate whether it's fair to paint him with that brush or not. Right then, our last little stopping point here, we're outside the Athenaeum Club, which is still one of the most prestigious luxury clubs to this day. And in Arthur Wellesley's time would have been a real gentleman's club. A club that has hosted the likes of Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle and other influential members. And probably one of its most influential members would have been the Duke of Wellington. So influential that on his request he even had his little horse block installed here, because he was getting up in age and it was getting difficult for him to dismount from his horse, usually dismounted from Copenhagen here. So he had this helpful block installed so he could dismount easily and then attend his club. So that was specifically for the Duke. And he became certainly more of a cultural and civil man, even though he was not very popular amongst politicians and in Parliament. He would have been fairly popular in court and in high society. And this is where he made a lot of his friends, which is not too far from his home. We've only walked about, I want to say, a mile, 2 miles. We haven't walked that far. So you would have been riding that distance, possibly down the Mall, possibly down Piccadilly here, or the Pall Mall.
And he lived at number 1. Say that.
Yeah, and he lived in number 1. What's it called? Number 1? London's number 1 house. The first house you'd see back in the day when it was first built, when you came into London. That's where the name came from. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content.